Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome, everyone. Today I am in the studio with Kristen Hare, who is the Director of Craft and Local News for Pointer, and Anna Trammell, who's the Program Manager at Community Archive. And we are going to talk about the preservation of local news. And sometimes when we talk about the preservation, we're on really big esoteric, like how do we make sure local news lasts? But we often forget about the very practical aspect of how do we make sure that the public record exists and stays. So I'm really excited to talk to you both today, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us. We are so excited to be here to talk about local news preservation. This is a topic that I know Kristen and I are both is near and dear to our hearts. We're approaching this in different ways. I'm an archivist by trade. I don't really know a lot about, working in a newsroom and some of the needs and workflows around kind of producing local news, but I'm approaching this from a different perspective. I know the value of local news as a way for documenting a community story and how vital that is to make sure we're preserving it now so that it's available for our local communities in the future to know, how their story unfolded at this moment in time.
Absolutely. And Kristen, so how did you kind of approach this work? And then we can sketch out what the problem is.
So I come at it from a couple different perspectives. The first is as someone who lost the first 5 years of her work from her career when,
Oh my gosh.
and I think a lot of journalists have been through this, when the newspaper that I worked for, the St. Joseph, Missouri News Press, I was a Sunday enterprise writer for my first 5 years. And when they changed their CMS, everything just disappeared. And it's such an interesting problem to have because I have teenagers, or the internet's forever. Whatever you put out there will exist forever. And it is actually so much more fragile than that. And so all of those stories do still exist because I had collected them and they sat in a box in my mom's garage in St. Louis for 20 years before I finally brought them down to Florida with me. And I can find them on, newspapers.com, luckily, but they're not on that website. And so just from the personal perspective of watching that happen and thinking, wow, this is quite fragile. And I didn't know that would be the case. And it's not because, somebody decided my work was bad or the work of my colleagues from that era was bad. It was a tech problem that we didn't anticipate. Right. And that happens so often. And then in my role at Pointer, I spent almost a decade covering the news and news about the news and then local news in particular, and started being really interested in, what happens when the internet eats your work. And when that happens to other people. And there are some pretty well-known examples of it. It happens when a newsroom closes overnight because the billionaire owner doesn't want to play in that playground anymore, and everything is just gone. And it's not really, it's about so much more than your personal work. It's about actually a community's memory, and who gets to decide what happened. The other place that I come to this from is from the perspective of somebody who is really grateful for preserved archives. I wrote a book 2 years ago about old Florida hotels, motels, and inns, and there just weren't well documented, or if they were, it was very shiny and kind of PR spun. And as I was trying to understand, when did this place open? Who ran it? What was the history? What was happening in this era? It was the original reporting from local newspapers from those eras that told me what that was. And because I was able to access it either through newspapers.com or local libraries or local historical societies, I was able to understand what happened. And if I hadn't had that first draft of history, it could so easily get twisted. So when Internet Archive, where Anna works, approached Pointer, um, one of my colleagues said, "Is this interesting to you?" And I just jumped out of my seat and I said, it is not just interesting, it is so vital. And it is, the way I described it, Rebecca, is it is a little bit like if someone says, "Hey, there's black mold in your attic, but your garage is on fire." Like both of those things are true for our industry, right? There are several pressing crises that we have to face, but the one in your attic matters because it's going to slowly, destroy everything, and then you'll have nothing left because you were only focusing on the fire in the garage. And
Mhm.
so, for several reasons, I was really excited to get to work with Internet Archive and IRE, who's our other partner in this, to try to help newsrooms get their born digital archives. Start thinking, come up with a plan, get them online, and look for partners in your community that you could partner with so that you are not the only one who is in charge of preserving that first draft of history.
Right. And so, a couple things that I wanted to draw out of there. Yeah, I think it's so compelling the who decides what happens. The person or the entity that controls, the information and the knowledge is really setting the lens. I mean, when you think about what people use archives for, you're right. There's such a deep dive of research there. And Anna, as our resident archivist on the show today, tell us a little bit about the role of news media in archives and what you see from your professional perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've spent my career working in different types of archives. I've worked in a public library archives, I've worked in university archives, and now I work for the Internet Archive, which is a nonprofit digital library that's really devoted to preserving universal access to all knowledge. So we preserve websites. We just preserved our 1 trillionth website this past year, so that's kind of
Congratulations.
a major accomplishment for our organization. You may be familiar with the Wayback Machine. Many
Oh, is
journalists
that
use
you?
this tool. That's us. So that's a tool that many journalists and scholars, members of the public use to view past versions of websites or websites that may no longer be available on the live web. In addition to that, we preserve millions of digitized books and audio recordings and software programs. So I've worked in all of these different types of archives, different environments, different communities, and I always come back to local news. That is just the primary source that I'm always referencing, that I'm always pointing our researchers to, because that has the information that may not be documented anywhere else. And when you're working for within a local community and they are researching a major event that happened in that community story, that information may not be available anywhere else. And it's such a great starting point to see, who are the people talking about this event when it happened? What are the key dates and places? So that's the place where I always go to get that information to lead me to other primary sources. So I can't imagine doing my job without having access to local news. So it's terrifying to me to see so much local news has been lost with this move to digital only or digital first. There hasn't necessarily been a plan in place for how to capture that content and how to make sure that it's preserved in perpetuity. So
Okay.
I'm thinking about this in terms of, not just who has access to that content now. I'm interested in, how can we make sure that we're supporting our local news agencies so that they can keep doing that work and producing those stories, but how are we going to make sure that it's accessible 50 years from now, 100 years from now? As Kristen said, it's the first draft of history. So we really need to be thinking about the future of that first draft and how we're going to have access to it.
Well, and it just occurs to me, of course, print media has its archives, and when I was younger in the industry, that was very important. We would bind our archives. There was a library of all those archives, and when and I'm old enough that I remember our first website and at the newspaper that I worked for, and it was like, oh, this is the side project that we do. And so I don't think that in general news media kind of conceptualize it like, oh, this is an opportunity to kind of keep, they just sort of, they were so focused on their print product that they're like, oh, this digital thing, whatever, we'll do it. And then you do have sort of that mindset, as Kristen said, like everything stays on the internet forever. It's only the stuff you don't want to see. It's only like the pictures of you looking horrible that really stay on the internet. But everything else, kind of comes and goes, even though there's that idea. So tell me about the landscape now. Like, because I've always just, if you need something that's old, you go to the Wayback Machine, but that doesn't seem like a really good, fail safe for everything. So talk to me about the landscape of what local news preservation looks like when you go beyond your print bound archives and when you're in sort of everybody maybe publishing on Substack or their own websites, or maybe doing, there's so many different channels. The landscape's so fractured. And I don't understand how you wrap your arms around getting archives on that. So I'm feeling very small minded. So expand me.
So as you've mentioned, it's very complicated. The landscape is very distributed and fragmented. There are very particular challenges with different types of news websites. They're not necessarily easy to capture and preserve. There's a lot of multimedia content. Things are
Right.
behind paywalls, or you have to be a subscriber to access that content. The news is updated very regularly. So I think that, people really love the Wayback Machine, but maybe they give it a little too much credit because they think that the Internet Archive is preserving every web page as soon as it's updated. And that's just not possible for us to do, especially when you think about how complex some of these news sites are and how frequently they change. So, what we do is we really rely on people working in these institutions, whether that's talking to and partnering with a local archive or a local public library, or a news organization, so that they can tell us this is worthy of preservation, so they can have access to our tools and services to make sure that that content is being preserved. So we're really thinking about this on a hyper local level and really relying on those local organizations to work with us and make sure that content is preserved. So we were very fortunate to partner with the Pointer Institute and IRE, investigative reporters and editors, to seek a Press Forward grant, which was awarded to launch a program called Today's News for Tomorrow, or TNT. And that program has allowed us to work directly with those news organizations. So, over the course of this 2-year program, we want to work with up to 300 news organizations all over the country and provide them access to the Internet Archive's web archiving and digital preservation services, and give them training and support so they're able to take advantage of those services and partner with us to make sure that content is preserved and is going to be accessible in the future. So we are in the middle of our first cohort now, which is
Yay.
focused on digital first news organizations. So primarily news organizations that are producing their content online. So this is how we're getting started, working with them to preserve their websites now, again, giving them some training to make sure that their other types of digital assets are preserved and accessible. And we're going to have 2 more cohorts this year. Our next cohort is going to be focused on more legacy media, physical
Mhm.
newspapers, kind of tailoring our program to meet their needs. And then later this year, we're going to be working with public media organizations.
Got it. So then you're really in the beginning stages of this 2-year project. And Kristen, Pointer, of course, is deeply enmeshed in many news organizations. What are you hearing on the ground, I guess, in terms of the organizations you work with? Are they on this bandwagon already, or do they feel like there's more? Do they have more garage on fire issues rather than this
Yeah.
black mold issue?
Definitely more garage on fire issues, I think, across the industry, particularly in local. And, there are places that I think have this under control. So, for instance, I think McClatchy has its own program for archiving its born digital news and making sure that that work is getting saved. They have a big network and they,
Mhm.
have the resources. But one of the things that's really exciting right now in local news, and it has been for a number of years, is all of these independent news sites that are starting that are filling the void that shrinking newspapers have left, and are doing more in-depth, kind of really, I think, nuanced and important coverage that we're going to want to have access to. And
Mhm.
most of them don't have the space to think. It's a thing they've thought about. It's a thing they know they need to think about. It's a little like once you have kids thinking, I need to write a will. Do we need we and every 5 years, "Do we write a will yet? We need to do that." It's like
Right.
it feels important, but we're gonna live forever, so we'll never need to do that. And I think a lot of newsrooms and newsroom leaders are aware that they need to start thinking about this, but how? And what do I do? And how do I figure that out? And it's so technical, and I don't have time. And so many of the really important programs that are helping local newsrooms right now are really very labor intensive. And
Mhm.
so what's great about this program is, there's an option where you can just say, I need Internet Archive to basically do this work for me. I want to use their services. I'm going to check a box, tell them what to do, and then they're going to, start the preservation process for me. And you can take a more active option and learn how their different services work. But in general, I think most newsrooms are not only acutely aware that they haven't done anything with their born digital archives, but that they have a warehouse somewhere or in someone's garage, there are boxes of their physical archives. What do I do
Mhm.
with those? Well, and they're, I think, even more concerned about what, our program is called Today's News for Tomorrow. What about yesterday's news for tomorrow? What
Well,
do we
that
do
was
with
gonna be
that?
my question.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got the whole history of somebody's legacy. I mean, the digital there have been digital publications now for decades. So, how do you and I'm actually super interested, I'm glad you provide the princess option where, someone else can do all the work. Um, but how do you choose which outlets you're going to go in? And then earlier, Anna, you were talking about in the digital world, someone has to curate. So someone has to navigate and say, this is worthy of being preserved. Um, so how do you make those choices both on sort of the macro level of the project and then helping people on a I guess a more granular level make those choices?
Right. Yeah, so we had an open call for people newsrooms to apply to join the program. And we were really excited that we had a lot of interest, and Pointer, excuse me, and IRE really worked hard to get the word out to their network. So we had many organizations apply. We were able to then group them into cohorts based on the type of media organization that they represented. Because another part of this program is we really want newsrooms to be able to work together and learn from each other and kind of develop that community of practice together. So that's really a part of this training for this first cohort, giving them the opportunity to have these asynchronous learning modules that they go through, but also to bring them together so that they can work together and have conversations with each other. But through that application process, we were really looking at a variety of factors. We wanted um, really a diversity of type of media organization. We wanted geographic diversity, but we also wanted to see organizations that really recognize that the work that they were producing is should be preserved as part of the public good. So in some of their responses, that's what we were looking for. How did they see the importance of preservation having an impact on their community and on the local news landscape more broadly?
No, and so that I think that makes a lot of sense because if you're doing two, I guess 3 rounds, focusing on different types of news organizations, do you at the end of that process, do you feel like you'll have kind of a network throughout the US, or are you concentrating on more overlooked or rural places, or do you have a strategy on where you want to end up?
We do, and
Yeah.
so it's actually is it so because it's a 2-year project, we have our first 3 cohorts this year and then another 3 cohorts next
Oh,
year.
okay.
And
So
what we
go
thought from
26.
the beginning was, let's see who applies.
Mhm.
It might make sense to group them geographically. It might make sense to group them by medium, and it did ultimately. We had some places that applied that we were surprised by. I was interested in the number of independent student run publications
Oh,
out of
yeah.
universities that apply,
Mhm.
which we know are also under a big threat as universities decide, maybe we don't care about independent media anymore.
Right.
So I could see us having a cohort with them. There are a number of organizations that work with journalists that have, reached out to apply. They might be a good fit. And so we're trying to, you know, kind of take it cohort by cohort and day by day to see how it develops and then what we want to do with it. But I think we also see the National Summit for Local News Preservation, which is coming up in June in DC, as a really good opportunity to have an even wider discussion with people who care about local news and the preservation of local news. And we're really just dealing with one corner of that universe. There are groups working on preserving photo archives. Specifically, there is a group working on preserving local broadcast archives specifically, which is also really important. And so if we can start to have a larger conversation nationally about this and why it matters, I think that also helps us raise awareness
Mhm.
and get more people involved with thinking, oh, I should do this, or oh, I missed that cohort and I can't make it, but who is in my community I could start working with? There's not a one size fits all solution to this. And so we're working on, like I said, one little corner, but I don't know, Anna, what do you think? It's a pretty big universe.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big problem, and there's going to need to be a lot of different partners involved to be able to solve this problem and begin to address it. And that's why we're so grateful to have our partnership with Pointer and IRE. But the National Summit on Local News Preservation coming up on June 17th. It's going to be in National Harbor, Maryland, so just outside of the DC area. And it's going to be right before IRE's 2026 conference. And this is really going to be an opportunity to bring these different stakeholders into conversation with each other. So, as Kristen mentioned, there are going to be people there who are thinking about preserving some of the physical records, digitizing the newspapers, digitizing some of the obsolete media formats from TV, local news. We're going to have, people who are thinking about preserving this digital online content. We're going to have members of some of our cohorts that are going to be there. So, really trying to bring together the producers, the preservers, and the users of local news in conversation with each other. So, that event is going to have some panels. We're going to have some lightning talks. We're also going to have some opportunities for people to brainstorm with each other and begin to develop some recommendations for memory institutions and for local newsrooms that they can begin applying to their work, whether they're a member of our TNT program or not. So that's really going to be something that we focus on in that summit. What are some of the ways that we can work together? Let's highlight some successful initiatives and partnerships. And then we want to release those findings from that event broadly across the cultural heritage and news sectors.
So if someone is interested in uh, think, thinking through this issue and maybe starting to get active, but not in your cohort, what are first steps that an organization should take? I mean, because it's not. I mean, I part of me is thinking, do you like upload it somewhere? Is there a central repository, or do you get into situations where we have like all those 4-inch floppy disks rolling around? Like, what do you, what are the first steps that you need to take?
I think I can answer this and then Anna could get more specific, but like the very first step is put someone in charge of this.
Hmm.
Who in your newsroom has both the kind of the agency and the interest to say, okay, I'm going to own this, make it somewhat part of someone's job, even if it's a tiny part of someone's job, and then write a plan. If our website shuts down tomorrow, where does everything go? If there's a fire, what do we do? And the same way that you think through, okay, there's a fire, where are we going to meet outside in front of our house? Like make a plan that everybody is aware of even if you're not ready to start enacting it. And then you can start getting into the technical stuff, which I'll let Anna talk about a little bit more.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that that's really the most important thing, and that's a big part of this project is just raising awareness, wanting news organizations to start recognizing the long-term value of the content that they're producing and to start thinking about how do I make sure this content is preserved. So even if it's just as simple as, realizing that you need to have a plan in place and starting to think about what that's going to look like, start documenting that. Would suggest reaching out to local organizations in your community, the local libraries or the state library, local archives, community archives. Those are organizations that are also going to have an interest and a commitment to preserving local news. So, talking to them about what a partnership might look like. We have so many successful partnerships that we're going to be pointing to at that summit of libraries and archives and newsrooms working together to make sure that this content is preserved. So reach out to those organizations and have a conversation about what a partnership might look like. But for anybody who may be interested in becoming involved in this program, as Kristen mentioned, we have 2 more cohorts this year, and then we're
Mhm.
going to be opening up applications next year. We're going to be releasing a big call for participation in our 2027 cohorts. So this is a great time to get involved. So you can reach out to us at tnt@archive.org just to let us know, I'm interested. I don't necessarily know where to start. If I want to be involved in the cohort, maybe I want to attend the summit. Maybe I'm just interested in hearing more about your findings from some of
Mhm.
these cohorts and some of these events so I can see how I might fit in. Reach out to us, tell us a little bit about your organization, about your interest in this topic, and let's figure out a way that we can work together and how we can support the work that you're doing locally.
Absolutely, and just to clarify, it's archive singular, so TNT
Yes,
at archivesingular.org.
that's
Um,
right. Yeah.
got it. And so I wanted to ask you guys, earlier, I think, Anna, you had said that as part of people starting this process, someone has to be in charge, someone has to curate what is ultimately um, designated for preservation. And so when I think of, the traditional newspaper, I think back to, archives, everything is there. So the advertising, the public notices, the articles, the everything. And how do you see when people are sort of making those choices, everybody comes with their own bias of what's important and what's not. Um, are people saving, are you getting that sort of all those wraparound snippets, or is it really like, here's the news article that's being saved, and kind of what's the advantage and disadvantage of doing it in those different ways?
Yeah, and this is where it's so important for us to be working directly with the news organizations themselves because they know the kind of content that is on their website. They know the kind of content that their community interacts with. They know what may be important for their community to have access to in the future. So, part of this process is us having those conversations with the news organizations as we initiate that web preservation process and
Mhm.
also talking to them about what other types of digital assets have you produced and here's some questions to ask yourself when you determine what types of material you think you want to preserve and make accessible. And this is the work that archivists do every day because we can't save everything, whether it's because we have limitations on just the amount of shelf space for the physical records or the amount of data storage that we have available. But also, we're doing our eventual researchers and users a disservice if we preserve everything, because how
Mhm.
are they then going to find what they're looking for if there's just so much content that's available? So part of our training for newsrooms is talking to them about how archivists make some of those decisions so that they can apply that, couple that with their deep knowledge about their local community to answer that question for themselves.
So what do you, in the archivist world, sort of what do you toss away? I mean, because you're right, you can't save everything. And I'm just wondering, when you have a set of records, what do you decide, oh, this is worthy of being saved and this isn't? How do you make those determinations?
Yeah, so this is part of kind of the training that goes into becoming an archivist is thinking about the value of certain types of content. So some content has historical value, some content has informational value, some content has value just as a historic artifact. So maybe having access to some of those digital ads, maybe it doesn't have a lot of informational value necessarily, but it has some cultural value. It has that artifactual value. So, those are questions that you have to ask yourself as you make decisions about what to preserve and also how you're going to make it accessible, because you should always be thinking about that access piece. That should always be part of your decision making around preservation, because if you're preserving it but nobody has access to it, then
Right.
what's the point? So that's also a big part of this project is we're going to be developing a central local news digital access portal for all of the participating newsrooms and all of the archives and libraries who we partner with, who are working in their communities to preserve local news. So we're going to be inviting all of these partners to contribute to the central access portal, so that there's one place that we can point researchers, so that we can point users to this central access portal. They can have access to all of this content, the web archives and the other digital assets. And, in the future, maybe this can continue to expand, and we can also use this portal to provide access to some of those more historical physical formats that are also so important.
So thank you for that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious, Kristen, from your perspective, news media is often very competitive with one another, and so I'm thinking about the time trajectory in the central repository, for developing stories or maybe series that are coming up. Like, I kind of get the idea that, if this is, like wire content is not going to be curated because it's everywhere, but sort of original reporting, maybe some different wraparound things, some of your public notice, some of the historically important things. But talk to me about the timeline of and how you kind of juggle the demands of the future with the demands of, like, keeping your scoops.
Right. I think that only matters to journalists, and I think that
Probably.
still matters. It still matters. It's not unimportant, but that's how we think, and I will tell you that if any of my local newsrooms that I rely on, are participating in this, and their work is going into this Born Digital News Archive, I am not, as a user, going to go there to try to avoid their paywalls. Like, that's just not really, and then people don't do that right now with the Wayback Machine. Really, that's just not really what it's used for. I think there's sort of two separate groups, but we do give newsrooms the option to decide: do you want to have an embargo period? You want to say this
Mhm.
can go up after 6 months or whatever. The thing that Anna has helped me really get, I think, my brain around is that. Um, Ultimately, we have some competing priorities, and the one that we agree on matters the most is access and preservation for the future. And so I just don't think that I think newsrooms are going to work this out and figure out what feels right to them, but I don't think someone's going to say, I want to read that story that was published a year ago that I don't know about, but I don't want to go through the paywall, so I'm going to go find it over here. Like, there's always workarounds, and
Mhm.
we're not seeing this as a threat to that. We're seeing it as another entry point for people who have a sort of a different set of priorities than an average news consumer would. Does that make sense?
Mhm. It does. And so you were talking about some of the competing priorities, and that the preservation and future focus of this was sort of the primary one. But what are the other priorities that have come around, and have there been sort of pinch points in this project as you've been developing? Because it's totally new. It's
I think
different.
I think the biggest pinch points have been getting newsrooms to go, "Oh, yeah, we do need to think about this. We need to set aside some time." And then what is the right approach for us? But there's also, like, maybe not pinch points, but, like, so many opportunities for, and these are things I'm really excited about for generating um, community connections, new content, and revenue out of your archives that a lot of newsrooms just are ignoring. And this is a focus of one of our live sessions. Is, you start to do a good job taking care of your archives. Here's what you can do with them. Here's how they can work for you. You need to be bringing those things out and resharing them to remind your community who they are, to uh, you know help people realize that if you are a place that has a paywall or a membership, they should join, and you're offering content they're not going to get anywhere else from anybody else. And so I think there's a lot of, I'm not trying to dodge your question, but right now I'm seeing more opportunities than pain points. If there is one, it may be staff time. And,
Mhm.
we've tried to really create this as the most streamlined, like, lowest commitment. We can just need you to tell us how you want to do this, because there's actual news happening and there are fewer of us covering it than ever. And there's more of that news than ever. And I think people need it from us more than ever, from an independent, nonpartisan voice. And so we don't want to say, hey, you don't report anymore, go worry about archives all the time. It can't be that. We don't have the resources for that anymore. So we're working to make sure we're making it as easy for newsrooms as possible to join us and to figure out a plan.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And you foreshadowed the flip side of my question, which is what are we always like to start with the pain points so we can finish with the opportunities.
Yeah.
So what have you seen people take advantage of? I mean, it sounds like community building in bringing out the archives, but do you have some specifics or instances where you've seen that really be successful?
So we're just getting started, and I think all of the newsrooms in this first cohort are really interested in this. But I have been looking at how other newsrooms have done a good job of this, and we had the editor and the product lead of the Atlantic join us to talk about how they not only got all of their archives digitized, but now have them organized and made them available for people to search.
Hmm.
And I think that the big news organizations, the New York Times, does a beautiful job with their archives. There's some really good examples of that. We're working to find and to help kind of foster more of those at the local level. But there's great content coming out of This Day in the News and those kinds of products. There is such a need when something happens for the journalists who've been there, for the journalists who relied on that work 30, 40, 50 years ago, to say, hey, this bill about this bridge isn't new. It's been up 5 times in the last 100 years. Let's talk about why it keeps coming up. There's so much relevance to understanding what's happened previously. And because I think sometimes in our industry, we're moving so fast, we don't slow down enough to remind people, here's what we have in common, here's what we've been through, here's what we know about the place that we live. And so there's a huge opportunity there, I think, to remind people what we have in common, and why local news is so vital. It's been there, it will continue to be there, and will help you make better informed decisions and better understand the place where you live.
That sounds amazing. And now I want to before we move on, I did want to talk a little bit more about the national summit. So that is, tell me who it's directed towards, how people can get involved. I know you're still maybe building out the panels a little bit, but it looks like your schedule's pretty set. So tell me more. What's going to happen on June 17th?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, that event will be co hosted by the Internet Archive and Pointer and IRE. So, Kristen and I will be there. And we are really excited about some of the panels and the speakers that we're going to have because I do think they represent many of the stakeholders that should be part of this conversation. So we have journalists who are going to be talking about the value of local news. We have, larger news organizations talking about some of their successful projects with local news preservation. We've got members of our cohort who are going to be presenting, who are really just starting to develop these partnerships and think about implementing some of this work in their, much smaller local news organization. We have scholars, we have people who are thinking about physical preservation, we have people who are thinking about online preservation. So, our idea with the summit is to start off with some of these presentations and panels just to give all of the attendees some examples of here's what's possible, here are some of the challenges that we needed to be talking about, here are some of the opportunities. And then in the afternoon, really devoting that time to having people then brainstorm about what can this look like for my community, for my newsroom, for my archives or library, and how can we scale some of this work nationally. So we're thinking about, the impact of the TNT program and how that factors into this, but we also want to have a conversation to think more broadly about what are the needs, where do we go from here. So again, we want to have those hands-on opportunities for people to work together, have those conversations, and then release our findings and share those out broadly across the news and cultural heritage sectors so we can begin implementing an actionable next step. What can we do besides having this conversation? Let's have the conversation and then think about what is the next step going to be? How can we make sure that we're moving forward?
No, I think that's brilliant because, getting people on board that this is even a topic they need to pay attention to. So educating them and then helping them create actionable takeaways is sort of moves people through to the next step. So I should have asked earlier, but how many organizations are in this first cohort?
We have 40 organizations, 40 newsrooms in the first cohort, and we are trying to fill out the last two cohorts for this year. So, again, we'll have the kind of physical legacy newspapers coming up in cohort 2. That's going to kick off in May, and then looking at supporting public media organizations for our third cohort this fall. So, hoping to have between 40 and 50 news organizations per cohort.
And then do you think after this first round of cohorts, do you feel like you'll have a sort of a playbook that you can say, okay, here, this is how you do it. If you're in the cohort, we'll walk you through it. But if you want to sort of freestyle, here's what we recommend.
Yeah, I think that this is going to be an iterative process where we're constantly improving our trainings. We're learning from what we see in the cohorts and making adjustments. And, we're hoping that what we see develop in year one from these initial cohorts, that they're going to actually be able to help us train and inform the cohorts that come after them as they start to implement some of these some of this training so that they can really say, realistically, we're in a newsroom, our kitchen's on fire, but here's what we were able to do about the mold in the attic.
Yeah, no, that I think that makes a lot of sense. And so, um, I'm sure we'll have you back on to talk about takeaways and whatnot. But in this last, as we wrap up, I just wanted to hear from both of you, kind of in a closing word on why you feel like this is so important now, and sort of like why it's important to you and your organization. And Kristen, do you want to start?
Sure. I started by talking about, the fumbles of technology that have led to, the loss of digital archives.
Mhm.
And that certainly is still true. You can lose it overnight if you change your content management system or have a tech change. But I think just as important is the human fumbles, the accidental
Mhm.
and the premeditated ones. And we know that there are concerted efforts to, alter the information that exists and to sort of rewrite history right now. And it's the voice of local independent news is critical, and no one is going to save it for us. We have to be the ones to do it so that when we look back, we're able to accurately understand what was happening. It's critical, I think, more than ever. Um, and we have to approach, all of the ways that it could happen with clear eyes and a plan to make sure that we're ready to fight it.
Absolutely. And we didn't even get into the epidemic of disinformation and misinformation. So thank you for bringing that in. Anna, any last thoughts?
Yeah, it's been such an eye-opening experience to be able to work directly with journalists through this program because this is an issue that I've been trying to address and the Internet Archive's been trying to address by working with those libraries and archives. So kind of being a step away from the news organization, but now being able to work with those organizations directly and have a conversation about why the material they're producing is so vital and why it's so important as part of the public good to make sure that it's preserved. So what I've been saying to journalists is, the formats that you operate in are not made to be permanent. The newsprint, putting something on your website, that is ephemeral. It is not made to last forever. But the content that you're producing, those local stories, that content is timeless. So how can we support your work? How can we make sure that it is going to be preserved? How can we honor the work that you're doing locally? And we know that journalists don't have a lot of time to think about this. So that's really been something that we've taken to heart as we've designed this program. Is figuring out, the Internet Archive has a lot of the existing tools and infrastructure. How can we leverage that to make sure that this work is being preserved?
Now, I am so excited to see what comes out of this cohort and also the panel or the summit on the 17th. If people are interested in joining you at the summit, I think they go to archive-it.org
Yes, or if
program,
you're,
right?
we've pointed to a lot of different resources. There's the
Right.
cohort application, there's registering for the summit, there's just telling us, what you're working on. We want to work with you. So the easiest thing to do is just email us at tnt@archive.org. We'll make sure that we can point you to whatever you need, however you want to engage with some of the work that we're doing. So please reach out to us, tnt@archive.org.
Perfect. Well, thank you both so much for coming and speaking with me, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, @mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.